my name is Arnaldo V Carvalho and I'm a Brazilian educator focused on board game studies and practices. Last year, I was responsible for the educational content for the Brazilian pavilion at Spiel. Thank you, Spiel, for this opportunity and Ludific to make this dream real. This year, Brazilian content creators will be physically at the fair, and because board games in education is a theme so hot to us in Brazil, I'm here again with a short take to say some words about our pedagogical view in this issue and what we have to contribute for board game studies, design, and practices in the educational field. To help me, I invited PhD Cynthia Dias, a renowned researcher from the area. Cynthia could give many important lectures about games in education for people around the world. She is a very experienced researcher, game designer, and teacher in a public vocational school. Better than me, how about introducing yourself, Cynthia? And even more, could you please start our talk saying why people from around the world should know a little more about how Brazilians are using board games in education?
Hello Arnaldo, thank you for this invitation and for a generous presentation. Yes, board games in education has been one of my main research and work areas. In my doctorate thesis, I studied the use of design tools to foster the creation of board games by students with their teachers in high school as a means of collaborative learning about public health issues. This research process has led me to get to know many initiatives which try and connect board games and education in Brazil, as well as disseminate game design itself among people who never thought of making board games before. And I think this is also a contribution to the use of board games in education, because when teachers know more about the variety of issues and competences that board games can tackle, and know a little bit more about game design, they can develop better games, more suited to their purposes, more fun and effective games, and in this way disseminate the use of board games in education even more. Okay, so let's talk about some of the Brazilian initiatives on board games and education that we know about. First, I need to talk about Ludus Magisterium, which you helped create. Okay, yes, Arnaldo? This awesome network of educators who apply or want to apply board games in education. The group was created in 2019 and has today 171 active members, exchanging knowledge and creating partnerships every day. A part of the result of this network was your organization of the 2020 and 2021 Education Brazilian participation at Gen Con and also at Spiel, with so many talks, discussions and workshops in board games and RPG in education. I also need to mention the Gamerama Collective, which has existed since 2007 and develops game design workshops for the general public as well as for students and educators, and where I started to learn about game design. In the northeast of Brazil, one of the biggest initiatives is Ludic Workshops, which since 2013 develops workshops in schools and other spaces, applying and developing board games and also teaching game design. Also, the northeast of Brazil has virtual communities, which is a research network actually, which develops digital and board games and research on games since 2002. Recently, I've been involved with a project from one of its participants in which nursing students are developing board games on health issues to use inside the health units with the public. Another initiative is Gorro do Saci, here from Rio de Janeiro, which focuses on developing workshops in schools and mentoring teachers on the use of board games. Another initiative on this area is Jedi, Learn for Fun. Also, Fast Food of Politics is an organization which focuses on board games for political awareness and rethinking of political issues in Brazil. Their work is also very interesting. Also, at Fiocruz, which is Oswaldo Cruz Foundation, our main Health Foundation in Brazil, since 2014 there is the Games in Health Research Group, which I am part of, and we research and develop digital and board games as a form of communication and participation in health. This group has also organized events on these issues, and we are always researching and developing new games in this area. At Fiocruz, we also have initiatives on the development of board games to teach or disseminate science, such as Imune, Caminhos do Osvaldo, and other games like about COVID-19. And I have been recently involved in the development of Semeando Cuidado, or Sowing Care, which is a cooperative board game about medicinal herbs and popular education. In this game, players represent health agents who need to talk with residents of the region in order to accumulate knowledge about medicinal herbs, public knowledge or popular knowledge, and cooperate in organizing this knowledge in order to win, protecting the popular knowledge. They also have to battle preconceptions and challenges such as real estate speculation, pesticides, and misinformation, which is very important nowadays. I am very happy now because the game has been selected as a finalist for Best Series Game as the Games Festival of SB Games, our biggest academic event on games in Brazil. I also need to point out that in 2020 and 2021, we had Brazilian projects awarded with the Gaming Lab Research Grant, and I'm especially happy because I am a participant of this year's project led by João Leste of the Pontifical University of Rio de Janeiro, in which we will use games to promote the integration of young people which participate in a social project.
We had an incredible talk with João and Mauricio, one of the leaders from the previous research. We can't wait to learn with both researchers.
Well, we could continue remembering other initiatives, but I think this shows some of our diversity and how there are many educators and researchers doing their best to expand the presence of board games in education in Brazil, despite all of our adversities in terms of funding for research and for education, and even in spite of the lack of a culture of board games, which is not yet fully disseminated in our population. Well, we could continue remembering other initiatives, right? But I think these show some of our diversity and our potential as teachers, educators, researchers, developers of games, and how there are many educators and researchers and developers doing their best to expand the presence of board games in education in Brazil, despite of all our adversities in terms of funding for research and education, and even despite of the lack of a culture of board games in Brazil, which are not fully disseminated in the population yet, right?
Great point, Cynthia. We're a country of contrasts. Most of our 250 million people are really poor, living in a rich place with so many initiatives in board games. Our challenge here, indeed, is to make all these incredible facts accessible to the population, and who knows, entering with a board games based in learning, we could help Brazil to change the things, to change the winds.
Indeed, Arnaldo. Well, about this, I remember a lecture you gave about teaching strategies, which I think is very demonstrative for teachers who want to use board games in formal education. Could you please talk a little about this?
Sure. Maybe people didn't know exactly about what we are doing here. Not every teacher who uses board games in education knows about many games or mechanics, nor have the know-how to explore games using, for example, game theories such as shell tetrad, whatever. But we are doing a big effort to revert this. And this points to another aspect regarding theoretical contributions to the field by Brazilian scholars. we are really interested in themes such as diversity and ludic literacy. So, that lecture could be a good start point about our practice in advanced mode. In that lecture, I tried to present the results of years tracking strategies for using board games in education. To then, I added others developed by me in my teaching experience. Well, we start from the 6 basic functions of playing to point out the initial and fundamental structure of all literacy, including the ludic one, linking to doing with pleasure. And in terms of ludic literacy, this means that this literacy starts with pleasurable experience for players, and these can occur spontaneously through culture, the entertainment industry too, but even the institutional offer from schools, educators, from museums and libraries, etc. Oh, we have a lot to say about that. So we talked about myths and cultural social constructions, about the right age for different types of games and play, and we took them all down. Going through other known fundamentals of playing, I would say that that lecture helped a lot of people to know the decisions that need to be made before starting an approach with board games in the classroom. Within that, I would like to highlight our study on the learning curve as an element of analysis and choice of board games for education. Working with learn curves allow us to think about an interesting point. Apparently, educators prefer fast and light games because they understand that they serve more students. We wonder to what extent being in the shallows of complexity is comparable to being in the shallows in terms of world reflection. That is, to what extent taking progressively more complex games, which require more time to learn and master, can also help students to deepen their experiences and reflections. I think this may be an interesting contribution from Brazil, as I have not located in the learning curve concept approached from an educational point of view. This same proposal leads to another, which is the challenge of working progressively with games over a period much longer than a class and beyond a single subject. This work, only partially tested by me, is still theoretical and most teaching practice around the world. It requires great integration among teachers, a school proposal that embraces the use of board games in a bold global strategy. In a video, Katy Salen from Institute of Play, and in my opinion, one of the most important activists of educational design thinking, said that in Quest to Learn school, they try to help kids understand how to be in charge of their own learning and continue to grow as learners. I agree, even more knowing that they seek depth and the development of critical thinking. But with so many information disposable all the time for anyone, we have to be careful to be successful in this task. I think learning curve notion can really be helpful on that. I don't want to explore too much aspects of the practical use of board games because we would need many hours, and on this subject it would be ideal to be able to do demonstration and use examples. It's just good to point out that there are many approaches, many ways to explore, many systems learning opportunities possible with the board games. And Brazil has some very original proposals about that. I think most strategies are shared by everybody around the world, but this is a scrap helpful to beginners. That's it, Cynthia. Let us talk about game theory and the Brazilian view and contributions.
Yeah, maybe people didn't know exactly about what we are doing here. Not every teacher who uses board games in education knows about many games or mechanics, nor has the know-how to explore games using, for example, game theories such as Shell's Tetrad or Zimmerman's gaming literacy. But we are doing a big effort to revert this, right? And this points to another aspect regarding theoretical contributions to the field by Brazilian scholars. We are really interested in themes such as diversity and ludic literacy. For example, in my thesis, I use the perspective of games as language, as genders of discourse and social action, based on scholars in the linguistics field, as well as game studies, because in a board game we interact with a system of elements which propose different modes of interaction, right? Of talking, gesturing, listening to others, and they help us interact and create meaning from these interactions about us, about the others, about society, about the world, especially if the game encompasses some theme about reality. In this sense, of course, the so-called modern board games propose some genders of discourse, some forms of interaction, which are relatively stable, proof read in a sentence by many and many playtests, but the mechanics are not all mapped out yet, because genders of discourse are mutable and ever-changing depending on the people's usage. So there is an enormous space for creativity, and I try to work in this sense, provoking students to think about game systems in reality, and creating representations of these systems that reflect their worldview, their criticism, their needs. Of course, incorporating the flexibility that the act of playing brings, not only in the product of their creation, but also in the process of the classes as a whole. And with this process, trying to stimulate them to think about the rules that govern our lives and how we could create new rules for our lives. And so to map a system in order to represent it in a game, we need to learn a lot about it. And in this process, the students know a lot about it. And representing it in a board game, we select some parts of the system and propose a means of interaction for other people in a way that lets us also hear other people, learn about social interaction and how we were or were not able to establish a communication with the players, to create something, some interactive system that is fun to other people. I think we also have to focus on our specificities, such as our social, racial issues, our popular knowledge, our culture. There is so much to explore, to learn about, and we have seen many people, not only educators, but also game designers, explore these issues, such as people who were enslaved, and issues about Afro hair, Afro games, Afrofuturism. We're seeing many people developing games in these issues, and religions, different kinds of religions of African matrix also. So we have such a rich culture and perspective on the world, because as a colonized country who has suffered 2 dictatorships, it is fundamental for us to reflect about systems, about rules, about how we got here, about what we went through and what people did back there, our political and social struggles, the value of democracy, and board games are these special means of looking at systems collectively in a fun way and enabling emergent narratives and discussion. So I think many of us are trying nowadays to work in this sense. But of course, in order to create games, as with any language, we need to play and criticize games. And this is, I think, one of the main issues on incorporating board games in schools. The lack or the difficulty in having a useless time. The rigid curriculum that we have so often that we have to respond to creates many barriers to the use of board games, to the playing of board games in schools. Because playing board games demands time. Sometimes more, sometimes less. Of course, with modern board games, we have a bit more control about how much time and which games we should use in which setting. But it would be wonderful if all schools could have teachers with this ludic literacy, with the knowledge of games, especially modern board games, but not also, but classic games too. And with not only with knowledge of games, but also with time in their schedule to promote moments of playing board games with students and their families. And in order to do so, we also need to continue creating bridges among teachers and other professionals also. And I speak of other professionals because I've been seeing the interest in board games, not only among teachers, but also among scientists, among health professionals, for example. I work at a health institution, right? At a health school, a health professional school. So I have seen many health professionals and scientists very happy to get to know more about what we can do with board games. And in Brazil especially, where we have a public health system that is a model to be sought by many countries, there is a powerful part of the health professionals' work, especially in the public sector, which is health education, and which has so much to gain with the use of board games. So I think our challenge is not only among educators, but also these other professionals. But I should not even use the word challenge here, but maybe opportunity. I think I have seen many of these professionals very eager to know more about games, very happy to get to know what we can do. Sometimes simple games open many doors, and we need to continue opening these doors and also making games, discovering our creativity, our power to create also.
Cynthia, I agree. It's a big challenge. But I think we are improving our point salad day by day. It's good to remember that the more Brazilian game design grows, the more we have material to use in education. And thank God it's happening. Before Georgie Adam conquests Europe with the roll and write cartographies, Kenner Spiel the Jars nominee, Golden Geek nominee in 2 categories, and more, we are exporting designs and also professionals into the area, such as Leandro Pires, Luiz Francisco, Lucas Ribeiro, Fel Barros, Fábio Tola, and even launching incredible publishers such as Dragori Games. This impressive development reaches educators from the area, and that when we have a party, I mean an educator ready to make incredible games as a lever to learning process. Oh, that I think board game specialists knows about this potential. I don't know if the educators are knowing how to use of this power and interact with the BG ecosystem. If they do it, both game designers and publishers can hear and develop very special products, so playful, but at the same time so explorable in pedagogical processes. Educators also have lots of tips for the board game set, supporting not just with more precise and scientific information for the game themes. They are in daily contact with students of all ages, and they know what they like, what they want to experience. Could you imagine if the industry passes to listen to this living survey, the educators? I don't know, but I think this is a global matter. Yes, bringing teachers, schools, universities, and professors closer to the board games ecosystem is really a big change, which will require an important campaign all over the world. The first step in Brazil is paying lots of attention on it, is about board games literacy. We don't have yet a definitive study, something that theoretically covers all the issues about this. But Cynthia has made important contributions. For example, when in her thesis she emphasizes that there's a play language, a multimodal one, with a complex structure. This topic allows us to think about ludic literacy, a concept that was launched before but under vague conditions. In education, Brazilian research has been concerned with 2 points: the specific multimodal knowledge of board games, and this knowledge directly linked to a pedagogical know-how. That is, ludic pedagogical literacy. In ludic literacy, we draw parallels with written language, ranging from simple literacy to full literacy, when the subject can detect between the lines and delve into a text depth, which makes it possible to understand, for example, who is playing, or whether the teacher who uses games can observe and formulate critical hypotheses about what he is playing or about the game he is proposing. Perhaps this example of Brazilian contribution already contains in itself our concern when dealing with games in a decolonial sense. A long time has passed since Brazil ceased to be a Portuguese colony, but we still live much of the impact of having been culturally forged in this way. As much as Brazil has built its own culture, we still gravitate towards Europe, which reduces the self-esteem of those who live here and makes it difficult for us to find our own path of development. Please, that doesn't mean we don't admire Europe. We will always do it. We just don't want to live the danger of a single story, as Chimamanda Adichie said. Fortunately, the world today has cultural diversity as its agenda, and this diversity would not match an Eurocentric perspective of the world. Thus, people in Brazil also need to feel represented in the themes and mechanics, and they need to be able to understand the different representations proposed, symbolically or literally, in board games. Because we are concerned with playing as a language, we have paid a lot of attention to the vocabularies used in the gaming world, particularly in game studies. I bring as a curiosity of a feature of the Portuguese language that somehow seems advantageous when we use it. I would like to say that the Portuguese language, no Brazilians do not speak Spanish, divides the verb play in two main meanings: the verb brincar and the verb jogar. Brincar, etymologically, is rooted in the idea of bonding, suggesting that it creates a social function of human attachment, development, and maintenance. It refers to a game whose rules are loose. It's the games of pretend, make believe. They don't have a beginning, middle, end structure. They don't have an end condition predefined by rules. Jogar, on the other hand, comes from joke, to provoke and be provoked, referring to interaction. It speaks of a structured game as a board games. This distinction, whose boundary is not rigid, is current in our language. These distinctions does not happen either in Spanish or in French, Italian, English, German, Russian. I was able to research the form of play, but I don't know if there are any other among European languages that make this distinction. The fact is that this distinction helps to specify two distinct fields of study, which often get confused. For example, if an academic wants to study more about make-believe, it will be more helpful for him to read Daniel Kunin. If he wants the game structured, he can read Salin and Zimmerman. This may seem trite, but the truth is that those who are starting their studies read a little on the internet and only realize that what they are reading is not so useful for the research when the context becomes better defined throughout the text. With the division of playing between brincar and jogar, we can straight to the point. It is curious for us to observe the immense work that Roger Caillois, an important author of 20th century games, has to semantically separate these ideas, proposing in agreement with Heisinger the use of Greek words like aleia and agon, when the Portuguese language already made this distinction centuries ago. Well, bringing back to the specific field of education, we already talked about cultural issues, criticism, but as we talked, the know-how about the use of board games in the classroom from very young children to seniors is growing strongly in Brazil. And now we think it's time to start some actions to spread this know-how and reach all sides of our country. More than reach teachers and their isolated actions, we perceive that it's time to integrate board games-based learning into the general school purposes, not just in Brazil, globally, which means to engage directors and, on the other hand, to claim from government public policies that make these practices viable. Yes, I think Brazilian research has a lot to contribute with the global knowledge and know-how in game studies and novel games in education. Now, I'm arguing to myself. All of those efforts give us conditions to talk optimistically about the future? What do you think, Cynthia?
Well, Arnaldo, I think all these initiatives with these researchers and educators who are in love with board games and education and all its possibilities help us to think of a brighter future in this area, especially considering the recent efforts in connecting people, disseminating their work and research, and promoting new research and development projects inside these networks and these institutions. So I think we have a very fertile ground, but we definitely need support from education institutions, from the government, and why not from enterprises, in order to disseminate the use and creation of board games and develop that ludic literacy we were talking about. Of course, we can have print and play games, artisanal games, but it would be awesome to have a group of commercial games available that teachers can explore, because these are usually more durable and there's that enchantment for the students to be able to open a box and manipulate all of the new components, the perfect components. And in this sense, teachers also need to have orientation and especially time in order to expand their practices to include board games. So in this sense, I would say that teachers also need leisure time in which they discover new board games with which they fall in love and get inspiration to work with them in the schools. I think we also need to disseminate the understanding that games are for all ages, for every educational context. In this way, with all these things, I think we can increase the presence of board games in education at various levels. And we are certainly working for it, fighting for it. So, what do you think about our prospects and challenges, especially in the post-pandemic scenario?
Cynthia, teachers need leisure time. E.S. Neal said that teachers would need to take, yes, Neal from Summerhill, okay? Need to take a vacation several times a year. He understood this free time as time to learn and come back to school full of energy to interact with the students in different classes. Where do they get the time and energy to push you more than what he already knows and does? The common tactics from Brazilian teachers in this case are to invite the students to create board games together with them. Without proper time, however, this doesn't always work at a high level of learning process. About game for all ages, first, we should remember that privileged layers of society can play for all life, but the majority of the third world population, they simply can't, because they are so explored and have to work for so many hours a day. And even the culture reinforces negative with a negative mentality. The colonialist mentality tells to the poor is a bad thing, is gambling, is a vagabond thing. By the way, with the push of entertainment industry offering cheap or free games for mobile cell phones, this started to change, but is far from the universal reality. Anyway, people are creating the habits to play. This, however, gives us another order of problems, digital problems, increased by the pandemic period. One of these problems is the system of learning electronic games are too much easy, and with so many rewards to the players that it turns the physical experience of play, which require the setup time, medium term time to read and share the rules, etc. All of this makes hard time for a fast food mentality. The same criticism about people preferring virtuality because of the reward system is applicable when you compare the way board games work as more like life in terms of mental hardness, in terms of not being a so instantaneous thing. Thus, we come back to the abysm between poor and rich, where we can find that the poor people are less virtually connected and more caught up in real-time sluggishness, and the rich people are more connected and more anxious. This chasm creates a huge turbulence, a kind of space-time disturbance, using science fiction about the time travel. And sometimes wealthy people travel to unconnected places and are amazed of how slow things happen. They did not understand that, in fact, that is the speed of the world, the speed of life, which they are leaving behind as they live more and more immersed in digital mechanisms. So we are counting on the help of electronics to expand logic culture, but by a hand. But on the other hand, if it means more people are anxious, well, seeking the middle way as a Buddhist monk, it will need to find a way to reduce poverty and give more people electronic tools that boosts their time. But at the same time, wealthy people need to comprehend the balance between this tool and their real lives. I think board game can help with it. Definitely. Susan Greenfield points to the need to build an interesting three-dimensional life for all. I really think board games should be a very interesting part of this healthy life. But when we join the anxious electronic stuff with board game collectionism and wild capitalism, I don't know. See, I'm not against the technology and several of its shortcuts. This talk, for example, is so incredible. It's just possible because of internet. But we have to put some frontiers on that and to privilegiate the three-dimensional life around us. And the slow life campaigns are so important to remember about this. I think the post-pandemic period will put humanity on a good track about this. People are anxious to have their real lives back. But I confess, I'm afraid that some people are so used to electronic speed that they might be disappointed with when the face-to-face human relationships return. They might be disappointed when face-to-face human relationships returns. So we're going to a moment of this game, the real game, the game of life, where we have hard decisions to take. We need to encourage education with good board games and the actual incredible knowledge from game design. It requires to create bridges to make the actors of education, students and teachers, closer to game designers and their know-how, as well the publishers and its capacity to turn projects into reality. To make board games more accessible and usable in the education, we need to rethink the model of buying, encouraging more collective actions, giving to the people more facilities where people can access board games easily, special spaces in libraries, playrooms, and schools, of course. We also need to rethink the multinational industrial models to reduce costs of productions and shipping, And this includes the encouragement to make crafting models using 3D printers acquired from this industry, for example. I think all of this can find support from crowdfunding methods and better local and global politics. All of these actions are urgent because our century demands a new education able to change the world. And board games are an incredible tool to make that a reality. As Carlos Brandão, an important educator from Brazil, says in Paulo Freire, education does not transform the world. Education changes people, and people change the world. I'm curious by noting that both education and board games industry are still far one of the other, living in a discrete pace of approximation. I hope that in the coming years this approach will accelerate and that humanity can allow itself to be more homo ludens. If it depends on Brazilian researchers and educators, it could be fast. We are ready for international cooperation in this regard.
Well, I want to thank you again, Arnaldo, for this invitation and to thank Spiel for the opportunity. And I hope we can meet again and help promote new projects that put games on tables at schools all around Brazil, connecting teachers, students, families, all education workers. And I also hope that by increasing the visibility of our work here in Brazil, we can foster new partnerships and research projects with other countries. Thank you very much. See ya.
Nice to stay here with you and share. My greetings to all Spiel participants. Have a good and ludic fair.